Thank you, Sister Rosine. I am delighted to be able to introduce our speaker. Herman Greene is the founder and president of the Center for Ecozoic Studies in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He is also the Thomas Berry Scholar in Residence of the Earth Law Center. He is co-author and co-editor of the legal textbook, Earth Law, Emerging Ecocentric Law, a Guide for Practitioners, which is actually how we learned about him. The title was so intriguing, we thought, this is someone that we might want to hear. Herman Greene also serves on the governing board of the International Process Network. A retired business lawyer, he works on corporate, tax, and security issues. He holds graduate degrees in law from the University of North Carolina, in theology from the University of Chicago and the United Theological Seminary, and in political science from Stanford University. Wow. His work in the Center for Ecozoic Studies focuses on the advancement of ecology and culture as the organizing principles of society, rather than economics and industrial development. He believes that the primary questions we need to be asking are, does this support the flourishing of life on Earth? And does it support full human development? Both inner transformation to bring about consciousness change and external transformation to bring about social change are needed. We will have a wonderful conference tonight, hearing indeed that we can find hope in these turbulent times. As Herman shares with us his knowledge gained in the study of theology, philosophy, law, and ecology, and the wisdom that he learned from Thomas Berry. Thank you, Herman, for joining us tonight. We really look forward to hearing what you have to say to us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored that I was invited to present, and look forward to our time together. I'm going to share my screen. All right. There's a speaker view I had to get up. Okay, so the title of my talk tonight is Hope in Transapocalyptic Times. That's actually a pretty hard word to say. It's easy to get tongue-tied. Turbulence, change, and survival. We might also say thrival in the 21st century. I didn't come up with the name transapocalyptic. It was coined by a blogger named Alex Steffen in 2021. And he had this to say about living in the trans-apocalyptic now. It's the end of the world as we know it, but it's not the end of the world. So let's look at this term trans-apocalypse. So trans means on or to the other side of, across, beyond, crossing over, also through. So we're crossing over an apocalypse, moving from one side to the other, and we're also moving through it. An apocalypse is defined as a great catastrophe that results in widespread destruction or the collapse of civilization. It has another meaning, which is a prophetic disclosure or revelation. And the root word means to uncover. So when a prophet has a vision of an apocalypse, the prophet is saying something about the future. Something's being disclosed to the prophet. And then he's offering it to others for their understanding and for their disclosure, and for them to do with the information that's presented, information and vision. So Alex Steffen, in talking about living in Apocalyptic Times speaks of discontinuity and gives his vision, revolution, disclosure of our current planetary situation. He writes, "My working definition of a discontinuity is a watershed moment, one where past experience loses its value as a guide to decision-making about the future." I think you have to underline that in a period of discontinuity, your past experience doesn't really provide what you need to know to guide your decision-making about the future. The planetary crisis is the interlocking, complex, accelerating changes our actions are bringing on in the natural world. Climate change is the largest problem within this crisis, but it is interconnected with ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, topsoil loss and water shortages, threats to food systems, changes in ocean chemistry, the release of rivers of toxic chemicals into the biosphere, invasive species, and so on. We can talk about them as separate challenges, but in reality, they are all one crisis. The planetary crisis is a discontinuity, failing to understand the climate ecological emergency as an all-encompassing discontinuity in human societies is failing to understand it at all, full stop. Every human system and planet, every time human systems and planetary realities clash, the human systems fail and human beings lose. It sometimes takes a while for the defeat to become obvious, but on a wide variety of fronts, the defeats we've already dealt ourselves over decades of inaction are growing unignorable. And then he writes, collective action, like a World War II effort, won't restore continuity. Yet crisis may not be the right word because it implies a short time period. We're not going through a short-lived crisis. We've entered a new epoch, even a new era, and the entry point is turbulent indeed. In his most recent post, he wrote about how we may all be climate refugees, not just the 190 million migrants that people write about by 2050. Many, many places will become uninhabitable or barely inhabitable, and it won't matter if you are rich or poor. So let's explore this discontinuity. Pakistan, 2022.
For days.
The rains destroyed everything. Then all my equipment was washed away by the flood. My house was razed to the ground. I still have the key of my shop. I don't have the courage to throw it away. It was my bread and butter.
This is the province of Balochistan, almost half the country's total land and the least developed. Fields, usually used as farmland, now completely submerged in water. And people run after aid, even if it means putting their lives in danger.
What we are seeing here is complete destruction. Everything these people owned is destroyed. Every bit of their land, every piece of their belongings is gone with the water.
Military helicopters carry out daily rescue operations in this remote area, but there are not enough of them to reach every part of this vast province. At a relief camp in Dera Murad Jamali district, families get basic aid, but the emotional toll of this disaster is clear.
The water was this high. My husband and I picked up our children, but the water was flowing very strongly. We tried really hard to keep holding on to our children's hands. They kept slipping. My husband held my hand and kept telling me to stay strong, to keep walking and not to be scared.
And the fear now is that time is running out for some of those most desperately in need. Farhad Javed, BBC News, Balochistan.
Okay. And now, discontinuity in the United States, 2023.
With just a few days until the first day of spring, much of the Northeast digging out from the biggest storm they've seen so far this winter.
And in the west, California continues to be pummeled by another so-called atmospheric river, dumping flooding rain across the region. ABC's Melissa Dodd joining us live from Los Angeles right now with the latest from there. Melissa.
Judy, Rob, at this point in Los Angeles, that atmospheric river really made its way through this region, but really left us behind with concerns of flooding and mudslides in some areas. Of course, we were monitoring the LA River all day today, but at the same time, across the country, other areas dealing with really severe weather. Mudslides prompting evacuations across California. CAL FIRE responding to this in the outskirts of Sacramento. San Francisco seeing strong Category 1 hurricane force winds that shattered windows and left nearly 200,000 customers without power. The strong winds, coupled with the already saturated ground, brought trees down across the state. Across the country, millions of Americans dealing with all kinds of severe weather. More than a foot of snow fell in Duluth, Minnesota over the weekend. The weight of all that snow caused the roof of this mall to collapse. Fortunately, there were no injuries. The Northeast, which has had a relative mild winter, was hammered by this latest storm right before spring begins. Residents from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts are now digging out, some areas seeing approximately 3 feet of snow.
I knew it was going to snow, but I didn't know it was going to be this much. It's just like ridiculous.
Thousands of customers without power, the heavy wet snow bringing down power lines and trees.
Look at that, completely over the interstate.
While conditions here have improved, now it's all left to kind of clean up in parts of those really concerned areas of burn scars, mudslides. You saw from that windy area in San Francisco. But then the next concern is just to prepare for yet another atmospheric river that's expected to hit this region in the coming days.
Watch breaking news on YouTube.
And discontinuity, it's not just people, like to Pakistan. Why do I begin this way? Why do I begin this way by telling you things you already know that I may not want to deal with head on? I do it to lay the groundwork for hope. Bear with me. The title of this talk is Hope in Transapocalyptic Times. Bruno Latour, a French philosopher and anthropologist who lived from 1947 to 2022, wrote a book called Down to Earth: Politics and the New Climatic Regime. He wrote that in addition to liberal and conservative, which primarily are designations dealing with human-to-human issues, we now have out of this world and terrestrial. We're dealing with human-Earth issues. For terrestrials, Rather than asking about the state of the economy, they ask, how are we going to subsist on Earth? Their goal is not to save the Earth, to protect it, or to live in harmony with it. It is to learn how to become dependent on it. We think we live above the Earth. We think we're not dependent on it. But in this trans-apocalyptic time, the Anthropocene, we will have to learn how to become dependent on our planet. They are not engaged in modernity's pursuit of some infinite horizon where everyone will have all they want and do as they wish. Instead, they are engaged in a journey to Earth, to becoming bound by Earth's limits, to becoming earthbound. And let's think about hope. I'll come back to terrestrials later. Hope in trans-apocalyptic lies with the terrestrials, the earthbound. Herman Greene in The Good Ancestor distinguishes optimism, a cheery look on the bright side despite the evidence, and hope. Optimism leads to complacency and inaction. Hope is a more active and radical ideal that recognizes the real possibility of failure, yet at the same time holds on to the prospects of success despite the odds, driven by deep commitment to an outcome we value. There's a little recipe for hope. Holding on to the prospects of success despite the odds, driven by commitment to an outcome we value. Jane Goodall, in her book, The Book of Hope, writes that people need hope to act. She says, without hope, all is lost. It is a crucial survival trait that has sustained our species from the time of the Stone Age ancestors. And she identifies 4 elements that are necessary for a lasting sense of hope. We need to have realistic goals, as well as realistic pathways to achieve them. In addition, we need the confidence that we can achieve these goals and the support of others to help us overcome adversity along the way. We suffer from eco-anxiety. After all, we're going through the end of the world as we know it. Michael Gerson, in an op-ed in the Washington Post on War's Horrors May Shake Our Faith, writes about hope on the other side of anguish. He talks about different responses. One is immoral responses to a tragic state of affairs. A tragic state of affairs is one involving death, grief, destruction. And that response is to live in smug indifference, or to feed endlessly on our own bitterness. So do you know anyone who lives in smug indifference to what's happening to our world? In moral responses, we can live in revolt against a cruel and meaningless world, adopting the existentialist, hopeless heroism and embracing goodness and justice in a doomed enterprise. Do you know of people that feel that the world is unjust and unfair and ultimately doomed? Or there's authentic hope. We can live in the hope that there is a deeper meaning, even if we do not fully comprehend it, and we can act in accord with what we understand the deeper meaning to be. So whatever betides us, when the world is changing, we can live in a hope that there's a deep meaning of what's going on, even if we do not fully comprehend it. And we can act in accord with what we understand this deeper meaning to be. Hope in the trans-apocalyptic times does not lie with those of the out of this world, those who pursue the infinite horizons of modernity. There's a formula that has been passed along in the environmental movement for decades, and it is I equals PAT, or spelled out I equals P times A times T, which means that environmental impact is a function of population, affluence, and technology. Interesting, isn't it, that we then propose a solution to the environmental crisis, these same things, technology, affluence, in other words, finance or growth, and that these will provide the answers to our ecological situation to the benefit of all people, the population regardless of our numbers, other species, and Earth's life systems. Global warming is the paradigmatic example of the ecological crisis. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its recently released synthesis report of its sixth assessment, gives the, quotes, party lines on global warming and what is needed. This, I get, is fact. It says that global temperature rise thus far since the beginning of the industrial age is 1.1 degrees Celsius, and you've seen some of the images of what that is causing. And then they say that likely warming will exceed 1.5 degrees, which, if you followed this, has been a goal to stay under 1.5 degrees. Although when you consider that we've reached 1.1, you can see that 1.5 would be significantly worse. And they say because of what's happened so far, it's going to be harder to stay below 2 degrees. Whether net zero is reached in time will depend on what happens by 2030. That's only 7 years, and will have an impact now and for thousands of years. The report says we need dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases, an immediate peak in the gases, and as much as a 50% reduction if we are to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius. But it goes on to say if we don't do this, overshoot could be overcome through carbon dioxide removal and storage. Rapid transitions across all sectors and systems will be needed to achieve the needed emissions reductions. These transitions will involve significant upscaling of mitigation and adaptation options. And then they say finance, technology, and international cooperation, including improved access to financial resources, are needed if the goals are to be reached. And just note the emphasis on finance, technology, and international cooperation focused on the international finance. So here's our present situation according to that report. If we follow our presently implemented policies, that's the red line, and the orange and the light orange beside the red line are variations of how things could be worse or how things might be better with existing policies. But the conclusion is that implemented policies result in projected emissions that lead to warming of 3.2 degrees by 2100, with a range of 2.2 degrees to 3.5. So at the Paris Agreement, Paris Accord, countries came up with nationally determined contributions, and this is what they pledged to do. So there's a gap between what they pledged to do and what is actually happening through implemented policies just 5 years later. But you see, if we look at what it would take, according to this report, to stay under 1.5 degrees, there's a significantly larger gap. And again, if you take a look at this pathway that would be necessary to stay under 1.5, and you look right here, 2023, and you look up here, 2023, and then you look at 2030 here, it calls for a 50% emissions reduction within the next 7 years. And then if we want to stay under 2.0, it's less. But you can see, again, there's a call for emissions to peak now and rapidly decline, which is not the case. We still see increases in emissions, and we'll be taking a look at that. So what we're going through is highly unusual. This is based on ice cores, and the black line in the middle is what the person who compiled this information thought the variations in temperature has been from the year 0 to 2000. And the gray is uncertainty estimate. So it could have been that high or it could have been that low. But if you look at this, here's the global mean, or actually 0 is the global mean, counting the little ice age. And the variations have at most been plus 0.5 or minus 0.5. So it's only since 2000 that we see a big variation from that to 1 degree. And then the reports is saying it'll be tough to stay under 2 degrees. And it's likely by the end of the century with current policies, we'll get to 3 degrees. Now, this is a chart of atmospheric CO2 concentrations in parts per million. This is collected at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. It's the oldest record, continuously kept record of CO2 in the atmosphere. And you don't see a peak. In fact, what you see is a very, very steady progression, almost predictable. So in March 2023, there was 421 parts per million of CO2. In March 2022, there was 418.81. So that's a little over 2 parts per million per year. And that means in 15 years, we'll be up to 450. And 350 is considered to be, in quotes, safe. So we have the organization 350.org. And 450 is very worrisome, leading to possible tipping points. So here's another chart that shows that greenhouse gases are not peaking, although you can see they're kind of leveling off. But this is 2019, which is the COVID years. The green part at the top here isn't projected after 2019, but that has to do with land use change, and forestry. And ideally, that would be a sink. There would be more carbon dioxide absorbed by forest and soil and land than is emitted. But at present, due to burning of forest and clearing of land, it's actually causing a release of greenhouse gases. So you see, in 2019, there was a slight downturn, but then it's going back up, and in 22 and 23, it will exceed 2019 levels. So why is it continuing to grow? Well, it's continuing to grow because the burning of fossil fuels is continuing to grow. Now, if you haven't looked at a chart like this, well, clearly you can see the line. You can see that things were increasing all along here. And you can see it was first biomass, and then it was coal at the end of the 19th century. And then we had the heavy use of, well, we had beginning of petroleum, barely can see it, but then petroleum grew. And then, actually, here's oil, isn't it? Then there's natural gas. And then in the 60s, there was nuclear. And all along, there's been hydro. And where does that leave solar and wind? Well, in this chart, the wind is this little blue line. And the solar is, you can't even see it. It's a little red line. And then there's modern biofuels and other renewables. And other renewables includes geothermal and wind and tidal, tidal and some other kinds of renewables. So what you can see is that so far there's never been an energy transition. So probably if you, and I was the same way, if you thought about it, there was a time that we turned from coal to petroleum. Well, we didn't turn from coal to petroleum. Since 2000, the use of coal has actually doubled. So it's beginning to peak back up. You can't see it. And oil was added to coal. It didn't take away coal usage. It just added to it. And now we have natural gas adding to, not taking away from oil, adding to. Nuclear has stayed pretty even because of, the nuclear situation. Hydro is by far and away the largest renewable energy, and then we have solar, wind, and other renewables. Now, sometimes we think about China as being a leader in development of renewables, and certainly they're the leading manufacturer of renewables. But this is a picture of the energy usage in China. Yes, it's true that wind, which is this, this is the wind, this is hydropower. The wind is this little blue line. Solar is just above it, and you can't really see the line for other renewables. But this is wind and solar up here. But look, what was the real source of the power beginning in 2000? That's when they had their great expansion, great acceleration. So coal, since the year 2000, has roughly tripled in China, and it's still growing. And the amount of energy being used in China is still growing. Now, on a per capita basis, it's still way behind the United States, but it's still rapidly growing, and they add about as much energy every year as Germany as a whole country uses in a year. So, so China now consumes about 25% of global primary energy, and this is still rapidly rising. And it is the leading greenhouse gas emitter. It equaled the United States in about 2004, and today it's double what the United States, but we earned the dubious prize of historically having the most greenhouse gas emissions and being second in the world now, and certainly on a per capita basis, way above China. So here is renewable energy generation. You can see what's happening. Wind is growing the fastest, solar next, and then other renewables are growing, but not as quickly. But hydropower is still increasing. If you follow the news of energy, you'll still see dams being put up around the world, and dams are not entirely beneficial. We know that from the salmon situation in the Northwest, but we also know other ways that that dams damage ecosystems. So when you think of renewables, it is at present mostly hydropower, although wind is growing much faster and may be a bigger amount. So renewables produce about 7,000 terawatts of energy per year out of more than 160,000 terawatts. So here's the global primary energy consumption. Now, what do I mean by primary energy consumption? Primary energy is the initial energy that's needed to produce the energy that we use. So if we get electricity and it's used to power our stove, it took a lot of energy to get that electricity to your stove. So this is the energy that was needed to produce the oil and coal and so forth that ran your turbines to produce the electricity and power the grid and so forth to get the energy to you, where it's the energy that you consume, which is different and lower than primary energy. So 84.3% of global energy comes from fossil fuels. In 2000, it was 86.1%. So from 20 to 23, or to 2019, this chart, it was reduced by 1.8%, 1.8% over the 23-year period. Now, so wind is 2.2% of global primary energy, and solar is 1.1%. Biofuels, 0.7%. Other renewables, 0.9%. So this is the illusion of declining fossil fuels, because people talk about growing percentages of solar and wind. And, you know, if you have one of something and you next have two, then you have 100% increase. Well, that sounds like a lot, but you're starting from a very low base. So you can show a rapid increase in the amount of renewable energy. But if the total amount of energy is growing, you can have a bigger percentage, but what's beneath you is still growing as well. So this is the illusion of declining fossil fuels. These are percentages of a steadily growing amount of primary energy consumption. Thus, a declining percentage of fossil fuels doesn't mean a decline in the amount of fossil fuels, as we've already seen. So why is the energy demand growing? Well, it's the economy, stupid. But by the economy, you probably think about you know, banks and exchanges of money and the stock market and so forth. But the economy means all the things that we use, all the goods and services that are produced that we use in our lives, our transportation, our food, our heating, our clothing, you name it. It's all the goods and services that the people of the world use that are exchanged for money. It doesn't count unpaid services, but it counts all paid services and all paid goods produced. So here you see this great acceleration in the growth of GDP. This is dating from about 1950. And so you see in 1950, this is expressed in constant dollars. In constant dollars, the global GDP was about $2 or $3 trillion. And here we are about 50 years later, a little more, 70 years later, it's over $100 trillion. So economic growth is driven in part by population growth, because if you have more people, you've got more mouths to feed, more people to work, and that results in a larger economy. So world population, when I was born in 1945, was under 2.5 billion. But as you well know, it's now just reached 8 billion. So this population growth has been made possible by fossil fuels and technology, and also by colonialism and capitalism, because you know, our country doesn't survive on its own minerals and goods. Our goods are produced outside our country, and we import resources into our country. And then capitalism and I'm going to put in quote, innovations in finance have resulted in this rapid growth. And when we talk about capitalism, we can talk about private and state capitalism as well. So Václav Smil wrote a book called How the World Really Works. He's a established expert in the field of energy. He says that when there was foraging and early agriculture came along, that supported 2 to 3 times as many people as was supported by foraging. And we reached the rate of 3 people per hectare only in the 16th century. In 2050, the world population was 2.5 billion. And of that, we fed 900,000 adequately. In other words, there was a lot of hunger at that time. Actually, more than, that's like 1.6 billion. We're not adequately fed. That's less than are not adequately fed today, which is, according to the World Bank, about 1 billion people. So we have 7 billion people that are adequately fed. That's pretty amazing that we moved from feeding adequately about 1 billion people to feeding about 7 billion people. So how did that happen? So what changed for this to occur is the intensity of our crop and animal production. And of course, that includes confined area feeding operations and the green revolution and fertilizers and so on and so forth. And this is all made possible by fossil fuels and electricity. So from 1900 to 2000, the global population rose 4 times, and 40% more farmland was utilized. Only 40%. Now remember, we were feeding 7 times as many people, or even more than that, because the figure up there is 2050. We're figuring, let's say, 8 or 9 times more people, but only 40% more farmland. But the energy subsidy increased by 90 times through agrochemicals and fuels for machinery. So these fertilizers are feeding to the plants the energy that they need to grow and grow more rapidly. My father was an agriculture economist, and I remember him citing how many bushels of corn were produced on an acre at a certain period of time and how many bushels of corn are produced now. So it is a fact that modern industrial agriculture has increased yields, but perhaps at the long-term cost of the land and other problems. Smil estimates that without fertilizers, we could feed less than 4 billion people with prevailing diets. So we're dependent on this, and economic and population growth are having devastating impacts on nature, including, in many cases, humans. Yet our lives are dependent on the economy, technology, and fossil fuels, and yes, present-day colonialism and capitalism, private and state. So we depend on technology and extractivism to get us out of this mess, exactly what got us into the mess. So technology, when we think, or we intuitively think technology makes everything more efficient, therefore it's a benefit. But remember that formula, PAT, environmental impact is related to the amount of technology, and the more technology, the more goods that are produced, the more we consume, and the more energy we spend. But now we want to use technology to get us out of what technology got us into. And the same with extractivism, that we will increase that in order to get us out of our mess. Especially with the hope that alternative energy will buy us time by addressing what we perceive to be our greatest problem, global warming, while giving less attention to ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, topsoil loss, and water shortages, threats to food systems, changes in ocean chemistry, the release of rivers of toxic chemicals, plastic in the oceans, invasive species, and so on. In reality, as we quoted earlier, these are all one crisis. So says Stefan. So what do? We call conferences of the world's biggest polluters, fossil fuel and other multinational companies, governments, and NGOs to solve the problems with technology and finance. And remember the finance and affluence. We're going to grow ourselves out of this problem. Most buy into the story that we have all the technology we need and all we lack is the political will. Joel Wainwright and Geoff Mann wrote a book called Climate Leviathan. And for them, Leviathan is the global elites gathering to make decisions about how we will address these rivers issues. How we will address them is by continuing development along the path that we've been following, except with renewable energy and some other things, in part to preserve their own status and privileges. With population still rising, elites believe we must keep global GDP growth at 3%, which means doubling. It's always equal to figure out how fast you double with a constant rate of increase. And that is you divide the number into 72. So if you divide 3 into 72, that's 24, which means doubling to $200 trillion in 24 years. So you remember that chart where the economy was shooting up, with only 3% growth. It still looks like that. It still looks like a hockey stick shooting up to $200 trillion. And all the while, this is sustainable development, sustainable plus development and growth, all while reaching the net zero target in 2050. Plus, and question mark. Plus, sadly, we are again a world at war, driven by ancient passions with rapidly increasing military expenditures and accompanying ecological degradation. We believe the elites, the media, because we believe in magic. We believe in decoupling, that technology really can make things more efficient, that we can have as one group calls for, a factor 10, that we can have 10 units produced for the same energy cost that it used to take to produce one, and that this will bring down emissions. But that hasn't happened. Between 1965 and 2020, the number of tons of CO2 per $1,000 of GDP was 0.55 tons in 1965. It's declined all the way down to 0.25 tons today, and will continue to go down. But that didn't bring emissions down. Emissions still increased from 0.2 to 35 no, I'm looking at the wrong thing on the right side, from about 10 gigatons in 1965 of CO2 emissions to it's actually up to about 40 gigatons today. So there is decoupling, but it does not result in the reduction of CO2 emissions as long as you have a growing economy and growing fuel use. We believe in magic. Moore's curse, Moore's law. Moore's law says that you can double the number of oh gosh, I'm slipping the term, transistors on a microchip every 2 years. And although it's incredible, that's what's happened. We have been able to stay up with Moore's law. I don't know what the very latest is, but for years and years, every 2 years, the number of transistors on a microchip doubled. So we think, well, gosh, we did that. We can surely do that with the transition of renewable energy. Well, this shows some comparisons. The one that's easiest to understand is the percent of US population owning smartphones. So that didn't even start till around 2010. And at that time, there was a lot of people bought in. About 10% of the population had iPhones at that time at the end of 2010. And today, only 22 years later, according to this chart, 21 years later, according to this chart, 90%. So that's really rapid. However, going back to a figure we gave earlier, the share of wind and solar over that not 15-year period, but 21-year period, it grew from just a little bit to about 3%. So that's 21 years. So remember, the IPCC report says that we're supposed to have 50% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which means bringing down fossil fuel consumption by that much. And what you again have to realize about the transition to renewable energy is that it took 200 years to build up the energy system we have, and again, there was never a transition; there was only additions. And so, for example, we have 3 million miles of oil and gas pipeline. That's about 300,000 miles of oil pipeline, I think about 700,000 of gas major pipelines, and then the distribution network to get gas to homes. It took a long time to build up, and that's not going to be replaced rapidly. And not only do you have to replace the power, but you have to replace what is using the power. So you have to replace cars with electric vehicles. You have to replace trucks with electric vehicles. You have to have factories that produce cement at 2,000 or 3,000 degrees somehow become run by electricity, and then you need to have production of steel, which is again 3,000 or 4,000 degrees converted. And then you have your existing plants; they all have to be changed around. So it's a mammoth undertaking. It's one worth pursuing, but one has to wonder if it's possible to maintain the present infrastructure and ways we live in making this transition. So another thing we believe in is magic is we turn on our TVs and we're told about clean coal, because coal can be burned and then it can be captured and then it can be stored in the ground. In the literature, if you follow it, it talks about carbon dioxide removal, utilization, and storage. So actually CO2, once it's captured, can be used again. And guess how it's used? It's used to produce more oil and gas by pumping carbon dioxide into oil wells and forcing more oil to come out, more oil and gas to come out. That's the primary utilization of CO2. But if it were to be stored, that's another story, which I'll deal with on the next slide. And something that's not often pointed out is in these projections where they say stay under 1.5 or under 2.0. They're always going over what's allowable to do that, unless you have this sudden stop and immediate drop, as those charts show. And so you remember the IPCC says, well, this is what it would take, but if we don't, we can go to overshoot and then we can pull it out. So instead, you run the global economy, and instead of it producing, 40 gigatons of CO2 or 59 gigaton equivalent, including methane and other greenhouse gases, they have zero, but you have below zero. So you have to have net negative emissions to compensate for overshoot in the budget. Now, what are the prospects for that kind of withdrawal? So global emissions of CO2, not counting other greenhouse gases, are about 180 million tons a day. So multiply that times 365, you get up to 40 gigatons a year. And so to sequester, and it actually weighs something, even though it goes up. This isn't Aristotle. It's not like it likes to go up. It goes up because it's lighter than what's underneath it, but it's still heavy. And it weighs 40 gigatons, and that's on top of what's already there. So to sequester 10 to 15% of the annual CO2, not what's already there, but the annual CO2, would require a mining operation equal to the oil and gas mining operation today. That's just 15% of the current year. So the goals for reaching these targets become harder and harder to reach as you go forward. You start here and achieve this 50% reduction in 2030, which they call for. You have a kind of, it's easy. This is the low-hanging fruit first, and then it gets harder, but you have longer to do it. But as you wait, it requires an even steeper and steeper drop if you're going to reach that. But they never call for, even though they talk about zero emissions, they don't really mean that. They mean net zero emissions. So net zero comes to the rescue. So net zero means that you can have a lot of emissions, but you can capture some of it. You can plant trees. You can have soil absorbing it, and that's all needed. But there's a trick in that, and it says that if you take 0 plane rides a year, then that's the same as taking 20 a year, as long as you have offsets. But that can't be true because you have the planes flying, you have the people running the planes, you have the fuel for the planes, you have the airports, you have the cars to the airport, and so forth. So clearly, doing 20, in net zero, it allows you to go as high as you want, as long as you have offsets. And then you have to look at the literature about what's actually involved in the offsets. So this term net zero comes to the rescue and enables fabulism, or making up lies. So ExxonMobil, in its report where it pledges to achieve net zero by 2050, and it only means in its own operations, it doesn't mean in the fuel it produces. In that same report where it pledges to be net zero, here is its projection of energy sources in 2050. So its projection is that there'll be 20%, 30% oil, 28% gas, here we go, 14% coal. So that's 72% fossil fuels in the year that they're pledging to make 2050. And that's down from 85%. So that's a 13% reduction. This is a global projection. And then it has this cherry note: energy in all its forms enables growth and prosperity. As economies grow, as technology advances, as consumers become more environmentally aware, and as policies adapt, global energy demand will evolve to create changing needs. So we'll have a lot more. This is 30% of a lot more. This isn't 30% of today's. This is 30% of a lot more. So it will change and adapt. And then it goes, the supply mix to meet the rising consumer demand will be increasingly diverse, drawing from a wide range of economic sources: renewables, wind, solar, and biofuels, hydrogen, and geothermal energy. Together will, let's see, I'm having trouble reading that. Together with carbon-free nuclear energy are expected to grow at the fastest pace. Well, yeah, they're growing at the fastest pace, but they're still projecting 72% fossil fuels. And it's not just them. You can look at the reports of the IEA and the International Energy Agency. You can look at the United States Energy Information Agency. You can have BP projections. They're all showing greater than 50% fossil fuels in the year in which we supposedly reach net zero. So we also believe in magic, that there will be sufficient energy to power modern techno-industrial cultures. So what allows us to maintain the complex structure that we have is an inflow of energy. I think of these gas stations that have these they're not really balloons, but they're men flapping their arms, and there's air that's coming up, making the arms flap. But if you stop the wind going, it just collapses. So in order to keep all of our buses running, keep all of our lights on, all of our air conditioning on, all the complexity, all the travel, it has to be fed by this energy, or just like that man flapping at arms, it collapses. Well, this is what, in the long scope of history, the petroleum interval looks like. They're not making oil anymore. And we better get this transition done, because we need the petroleum to build out the renewable energy. The renewable energy over the life of, say, a solar panel or a windmill will be a net reduction in energy, but up front, there's a lot more energy involved in building it. And so you have upfront energy costs. And actually, if you really did have this World War II mobilization to build this all out, it would be a tremendous increase in energy, unless we all sacrifice greatly our own energy uses in order to allow this transition to go forward. And they also assume that there will be sufficient other minerals, and mining them will be benign, which those of you who've read about cobalt mining in oh gosh, here I go, in Africa, let's just say Africa, I'll think of it in a minute, is anything but benign. And then there's this hope that there's some other source of energy that will eventually pull us through. And we talked about fusion, and in December there was a lot of news about this net increase in fusion. And that was like a trillionth of a second. And I don't have the article in front of me, but if you look at the equipment it took to produce this trillionth of a second burst, it was incredible. And all they got was just a little bit more than all the laser power that went into it. And there's no way to harness that. I mean, you're operating at 3 million degrees. What materials do we have that can allow sustain fusion, the energy of the sun? So, it's been said that fusion is always 20 years away. And, I have scientist friends who really do believe that it is feasible to do this. And I remain doubtful. This whole thing is so complex that we can't really figure it out. And so we create stories. I see I'm going very long, excuse me. I'll try to finish this up. So we create stories about what will happen, and that's all we can do. So if you have a different story, that's okay. This is mine, I'm telling you. So what does this mean for those of us who earnestly want a thrivable future and are willing to sacrifice to achieve it? Well, it's not rocket science. This is sustainable. This is not. The great work to which we are called is more like this than like this. So what do we do? Well, do we double down on our present course in order to achieve 50% emissions reductions by 2030? Now, I showed you my slideshow. I'll share it. You consider how likely that would be to achieve net zero by 2050. Again, knowing that that doesn't really mean lack of fossil fuels. It means net zero offsetting. Or do we say that that's just not going to work, that we're going to take another way? Now, we can't choose that individually, but we can, in our minds, we can, as one book calls it, learn to die in the Anthropocene, learn to accept that the world as we've known it is passing away. We can accept that our modern technological industrial cultures have collapse built into them. Ruben Nelson of Foresight Canada said this is already happening and it's irrevocable. However, unlike some people, don't expect this to happen like tomorrow or in the next 20 years or 30 years. There's a lot of life left in modern technological industrial cultures. Or do we operate out of a fundamentally different vision while still maintaining aspects of science, technology, and alternative energy and some aspects of modernity? So at the same time, this will run into difficulty if my story is right. There will be a new society emerging underneath it from those who choose this route. But this is going to be difficult because of competing visions and forces. Here are two important perspectives. Ruben Nelson says much of the talk about societal transformation unknowingly is still promoting a future which, when you scratch under its surface, is mostly a vision of a better MTI world. And for time, I'll skip down to the next one. This is someone writing from the Global South. Firstly, the modern Western or imperial way of life was sold to us of the South as a generalizable ideal, but this was only possible in the North at the expense of the people of the South in terms of cheap labor and materials. Secondly, its expansion only deepened the civilizational crisis and its catastrophic effects in the terms of the destruction of ways of life and the expansion of violence and social relations instead of increasing welfare. Hope in our trans-apocalyptic times belongs to the terrestrials, the earthbound, not the out of this world. And I have ideas of what we're moving toward with an ecological civilization. I think that to preserve some time for questions, I can't really go into this. I really wish I could, and I feel bad that I've taken so much time getting to this point. But I will perhaps read here. An ecological civilization understands Earth as oikos or eco, which means our Earth home. It lives by standards of fundamental justice and fairness for all humans. It recognizes the rights of all species to habitat, nourishment, and dignified participation in the community of life. It honors all living components and processes of Earth and their qualitative as well as their functional roles. It has two primary questions. Does this promote the flourishing of life on Earth? And does this promote full human development? It meets these criteria living within Earth's means, providing sufficiency for all humans, fosters biodiversity and healthy ecosystem, and it provides for the needs of future generations of all species. It's grounded in local communities and bioregions and in historic cultures and classical civilizations. It protects the commons at global, regional, and local levels. It's unified by a shared sense of the sacredness of Earth community. It's a process concept, not something to be arrived at, but something ever to be created. So how do we bring this about? Find your North Star and follow it. I've been sustained by Thomas Berry's vision of an Ecozoic era, a time of mutually enhancing relations among humans and the larger community of life. And by his guidance that the great work of our time is to move on from modern techno-industrial civilization with its devastating impact to benign presence. Declare yourself to be an Ecozoan. Ecozoans are people who are lovers of life, of all kinds of life. They santi piansan, feel, think with Earth community, and they seek the wisdom of the life world. Understand that this movement is not like any other movement you know of. There's no line where you can make a frontal assault. Everything is involved. Billions of people and trillions of decisions a point. Don't try to fix it or use a problem solution approach. Accept that we are living in the age of consequences. It will be the end of industrial civilization if we know it. Fossil fuels will be depleted or their use largely abandoned. Earth will become hotter and less habitable. Population growth will end. Shortages of water and food will become chronic. biodiversity will decline, flora, fauna, and people will migrate. Hot, cold, and digital wars will occur. Regional alliances and states will change. Technology will expand and falter. Ideologies, cultures, and ways of living will clash and be transformed. Yet, while the world as we know it will end, it will not be the end of the world. This is the mean trans-apocalyptic. Humanity will move from endless growth to living within limits, from rights to responsibilities, and nature will have its due. Live the adventure with your eyes open. It took hundreds of thousands of years before humans had a written language. The industrial world has been a great ride, but there's a better world that we know is possible. Okay, and I'll end there. End the show, and let's stop my share.
We will entertain questions to the author if we have any.
Any questions, comments? If you're online, you can raise your hand. I'll count on Rosine and others that are present at Lord's University to allow people to ask questions there.
So how do you keep yourself going from day to day?
Well, you know, it's I don't feel a sense of impending doom personally. I don't feel exempt. I have trees over my house, and I think regularly about what would happen if they fall on my house. But you know, I live my life. I think that we do have some time to deal with this, and I think the world is learning, is in a process of learning, and I'm happy I can participate in this. I feel like I'm at the beginning of creating a new age, and that's exciting.
I think that's kind of how most of us feel. You know, we're doing our little things, what we can do in this time of transition, and you know, God only knows what the future will be like. But it's not that I haven't thought about it, but you know, we're trying to do something new, but in trying to do something new, we're creating technology that actually uses more stuff, you know? And
I think for me, one of the things that I really like about what Pope Francis has written in Laudato Si is this call to live a simpler life. And that simpler doesn't mean necessarily less deprivation, but really enjoying what you have and learning what you need and living off of that. I think that's the call that is one of the primary calls that we all have to face. More is not better. And I think you really showed that very dramatically in the graphs and charts that you showed us. That I think that even as a society has to scale that, we ourselves have to do it. And I think that's going to be one of the pushes that will move things forward in the future.
Yeah, that's true. You know, it's going to be, we'd like to think we can get out in front of all this and plan ahead and make things happen and have a smooth transition. We'd like to think that we should have done that earlier, that we are where we are. And a lot of these changes are going to be, in our face. You know, that if you have the atmospheric river in San Francisco, you don't have a choice but to have some kind of reaction to that. And we're not in a situation anymore where we're looking at what might happen. We're looking at what is happening.
Yeah. Maybe this also is not so much just for the earth, but we humans are going through a period where we are in the midst of this transformation, and maybe this is our task as humans, to be able to do this. You know, you don't know what what's gonna be like after that, but, you know, we're
Yeah.
actually creating a new human, and in the past, you know, when we had like the Neanderthal people and all those, you know, they didn't know what was gonna be happening, they lived their life and went through it, and now we're the next step, and then I don't know what the next step after us is, but, I think that gives me the hope, you know, that I need.
Yeah, that's good. You know, one of my slides talks about the full serenity prayer, and it talks about after it goes through the wisdom to know the difference, it says living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the way to pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that God will make all things right if I surrender to God's will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with God forever in the next. So we don't choose the time and place in which we're born. We could have been born in England in 1941.
Yeah.
We're born into, you know, this is where we're born, and this is the great work we've been given. And it's a great privilege, really, to be here.
Yeah, Herman, we thank you for being here. It's about time we gotta quit. And, but we thank you for all the insights that you've given us. Some depressing, some uplifting, something to think about, you know. But we'd like to give you one more round of applause before we.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget, May 9th is our awards night. If anybody, you know, wants to come, please do, to celebrate all the people that have been doing some wonderful things on our earth. So thank you for coming. Have a good evening. Be careful going home, and maybe we'll see you on May 9th.
Thank you.
Yep.